Watch complete video having 20 parts of the whole journey of UFC evolution from its inception to current age. The birth of a combat revolution. In the world of combat sports, few organizations have transformed as dramatically as the Ultimate Fighting Championship, UFC. What began as a no-holds-barred spectacle in 1993 has evolved into a global sports empire, redefining martial arts competition. The UFC's journey is a story of innovation, controversy, and resilience, one that turned a once-outlawed sport into a billion-dollar industry. But to truly understand its rise, we must go back to the very beginning, when a small group of visionaries sought to answer one of the most debated questions in martial arts history. Which fighting style is the most effective? With traditional martial arts often relying on theory rather than practical combat, the idea of a competition that pitted disciplines against each other sparked immense curiosity and intrigue. It was a concept that would forever change the landscape of hand-to-hand combat and push the limits of human endurance and skill. The UFC was set to challenge conventional fighting wisdom, forcing the world to rethink what it truly meant to be a martial artist in real-world combat scenarios. That question led to the birth of UFC 1, held on November 12, 1993 in Denver, Colorado. Founded by Art Davie, Royce Gracie, and Bob Merowitz, the event was designed to pit different martial arts against each other in a raw, unscripted battle. Fighters from karate, boxing, wrestling, kickboxing, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu stepped into the cage with minimal rules, no weight classes, and bare-knuckle aggression. It was as real as it could get. A modern-day gladiator contest that shocked audiences and ignited an underground fan base. Unlike other combat sports where regulations and safety measures dictated the action, the UFC provided an unfiltered view into what truly worked in a fight. What happened that night would lay the foundation for a combat revolution, with one name emerging as an unlikely hero: Royce Gracie. The event's success ensured that a new era of mixed martial arts had begun, forever altering the perception of hand-to-hand combat worldwide. The rise of Royce Gracie. Royce Gracie, a relatively small and unassuming Brazilian fighter, entered UFC 1 representing his family's martial art, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Unlike the muscular strikers and wrestlers in the tournament, Gracie relied on technique, leverage, and ground control to dismantle his opponents. In a shocking display of dominance, he submitted 3 fighters in one night, proving that grappling was the ultimate equalizer in a fight. His effortless victories against much larger and stronger opponents sent a powerful message. Size and brute strength were no match for superior skill and strategy. The Gracie philosophy revolved around patience and precision, proving that fighting was not just about power, but about intelligence and adaptability in unpredictable situations. His victories made it clear that brute force alone was insufficient in a real fight, forcing martial artists worldwide to reconsider their training methods and adapt to this evolving combat landscape. Gracie's triumph not only showcased the effectiveness of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but also changed the perception of martial arts forever. Fans and fighters alike realized that striking alone was not enough. Ground fighting had to be mastered. This revelation fueled the growth of MMA, with gyms across the world scrambling to add grappling techniques to their training. His dominance in early UFC events forced other fighters to reconsider their approach and add submission defense to their skill sets. The success of Royce Gracie established the UFC as the ultimate testing ground for martial arts and set the stage for a new era of fighters who would embrace a more well-rounded approach to combat. The impact of his victories rippled through combat sports, leading to a rapid evolution where one-dimensional fighters struggled to survive. His legacy extended far beyond the octagon as he became a symbol of the effectiveness of technique over raw strength, shaping the future of combat sports forever. The no-rules era and public outrage. In its early years, the UFC was a brutal, unregulated spectacle marketed as a real-life version of bloodsport. There were no gloves, no weight classes, and barely any rules. Fighters could headbutt, kick a downed opponent, and even strike the groin. This raw and unfiltered violence drew both fascination and outrage. While hardcore fans loved the unpredictability and authenticity, critics saw it as nothing more than human cockfighting. Politicians and media figures, including Senator John McCain, launched aggressive campaigns against the UFC, calling for its ban across the United States. The violent nature of the competition made it difficult for the organization to find sponsors or secure television deals, further pushing it to the fringes of mainstream sports. The debate over its legitimacy threatened the very survival of the sport, as mainstream networks distanced themselves from what was perceived as sheer brutality without oversight. The backlash was swift and severe. Several states outlawed the sport, major cable providers refused to air UFC events, and the promotion found itself on the brink of collapse. Despite the growing hostility, the UFC's leadership knew they had something special. Instead of backing down, they saw an opportunity to evolve. If mixed martial arts were to survive, it needed legitimacy, structure, and a complete overhaul of its rules. The UFC had to strike a balance between maintaining the sport's raw appeal while ensuring fighter safety and compliance with regulatory bodies. This realization would mark the beginning of the UFC's transformation from an underground spectacle into a globally recognized sport. With financial troubles looming and increasing pressure from lawmakers, the next phase in UFC history would be one of reinvention and survival. The challenge ahead was not just about sustaining the sport, but about turning it into something that could be respected on the same level as traditional martial arts and combat sports like boxing. The introduction of rules and regulation, facing mounting pressure from lawmakers and media scrutiny, the UFC had no choice but to adapt. The first major step toward legitimacy came with the introduction of referee stoppages at UFC 3 in 1994. Before this, fights could only end by knockout, submission, or a corner throwing in the towel. Referees now had the authority to step in and protect fighters from unnecessary damage, a move that significantly improved fighter safety and helped the UFC gain credibility. This rule change marked the beginning of the UFC's transition from a controversial spectacle to a structured sport. It was a necessary step, as concerns about excessive brutality threatened the future of the promotion. Without proper oversight, the UFC risked permanent bans from state commissions, which would have sealed its fate before it had a chance to evolve. In the following years, more regulations were introduced to reshape the sport. Weight classes were implemented at UFC 12 in 1997, preventing dangerous mismatches between fighters of vastly different sizes. Soon after, the mandatory use of gloves was enforced to protect fighters' hands and reduce cuts. These changes, along with the banning of groin strikes, headbutts, and other dangerous techniques, signaled the UFC's commitment to transforming MMA into a legitimate sport. Fighters had to adjust their styles and strategies, moving away from bare-knuckle brawling to a more refined form of combat. While some traditionalists resisted these changes, most fighters recognized that a regulated environment would lead to greater acceptance and financial success. This transformation laid the groundwork for mainstream recognition, but the battle for legitimacy was far from over. The dark ages of the UFC. Despite introducing rules and safety measures, the UFC still struggled to gain mainstream acceptance. By the late 1990s, the promotion was in financial turmoil as pay-per-view providers dropped UFC events, and athletic commissions refused to sanction fights. With limited revenue and a tarnished reputation, the company found itself unable to attract sponsors or secure television deals. Attendance at live events dwindled, and without a clear path forward, the UFC was on the verge of collapse. The very sport that had shown so much promise was now viewed as a failing business model, unable to overcome the stigma of its early years. Fighters who had committed themselves to this new style of combat faced an uncertain future, with many unsure if MMA would ever become a stable career option. During this period, known as the Dark Ages of the UFC, the sport was kept alive by a dedicated underground fan base. Hardcore MMA enthusiasts continued to follow the events through tape trading and internet forums, keeping the spirit of mixed martial arts alive. Meanwhile, in Japan, Pride Fighting Championships emerged as a dominant force, offering massive production value and attracting the world's best fighters. While the UFC struggled, Pride flourished, showing what MMA could become when marketed correctly. Many of the top UFC fighters even made their way to Japan, seeking bigger paydays and larger audiences. As the UFC faded into obscurity, its survival depended on a game-changing intervention, one that would come in the form of a bold business move that would forever alter its future. The Zuffa takeover and a new beginning. In 2001, the UFC was rescued from the brink of collapse when casino executives Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta, along with their longtime friend Dana White, purchased the organization for just $2 million. The Fertitta brothers, armed with deep financial resources and political connections, saw potential where others saw failure. With Dana White as president, they launched an aggressive strategy to rebuild the UFC, focusing on regulation, marketing, and expansion. Their first goal was to work with state athletic commissions to ensure that MMA was recognized as a legitimate sport. Without regulatory approval, the UFC would never be able to reach the mainstream audience it needed to survive. Their experience in the casino business gave them the knowledge and influence necessary to navigate the complex world of sports governance. One of their first moves was working with state athletic commissions to implement the unified rules of mixed martial arts, which standardized weight classes, rounds, and legal techniques. This move helped the UFC gain official recognition as a legitimate sport. At the same time, they ramped up production quality, signing new talent, and improving fighter pay. The Fertittas understood that in order to attract top-tier athletes, they needed to create an environment where fighters could make a living. They also rebranded the UFC, focusing on its entertainment value while maintaining the integrity of competition. While these changes put the UFC on a path to stability, the promotion still lacked one critical element: mainstream exposure. The next step would require a bold move that would forever change combat sports: the Ultimate Fighter and the UFC boom. With the UFC still struggling to break into the mainstream, the Fertitta brothers took a massive gamble in 2005 by funding a reality TV show called The Ultimate Fighter, TUF. The show followed a group of aspiring fighters living and training together, competing for a contract with the UFC. Broadcast on Spike TV, TUF introduced MMA to a new audience, humanizing fighters and showcasing their dedication, struggles, and personalities beyond the cage. By allowing fans to see the sacrifices, training, and mental toughness required to be a professional fighter, the show generated a newfound appreciation for the sport. It was the breakthrough the UFC desperately needed, as the reality format appealed to mainstream audiences who had previously dismissed MMA as too violent or unstructured. The turning point came in the season finale when Forrest Griffin and Stephan Bonnar engaged in an all-out war that captivated viewers and had UFC president Dana White convinced that the sport had finally arrived. The fight was so thrilling that Spike TV executives immediately offered the UFC a long-term television deal. This exposure ignited the modern MMA boom, transforming the UFC from a struggling promotion into a rapidly growing sports phenomenon. Pay-per-view numbers surged, new sponsorship deals poured in, and mainstream media finally started to recognize MMA as a legitimate sport. With new stars emerging and pay-per-view sales skyrocketing, the UFC was now on its way to global domination, proving that MMA was no longer a niche sport, but a major player in the world of athletics. The rise of superstar fighters. With mainstream exposure secured, the UFC needed larger-than-life personalities to captivate audiences and drive pay-per-view sales. Fighters like Chuck Liddell, Randy Couture, and Tito Ortiz became household names, each bringing their own unique appeal to the sport. Liddell, with his knockout power and signature mohawk, became the UFC's first true mainstream star. Couture, a seasoned wrestler, gained respect as a tactical and disciplined veteran. Ortiz, the brash and charismatic Huntington Beach bad boy, thrived on controversy and rivalries, keeping fans engaged both inside and outside the cage. These early stars played a crucial role in shaping the UFC's identity, making it clear that MMA was not just about fighting, it was also about storytelling and building compelling personalities that audiences could connect with. As the UFC expanded, more stars emerged, including Georges St-Pierre, Anderson Silva, and BJ Penn, each dominating their respective divisions with unique fighting styles. St-Pierre's disciplined approach, Silva's dazzling striking, and Penn's aggressive fighting spirit solidified their places as legends in the sport. These fighters brought legitimacy to the UFC, proving that MMA was more than just raw aggression. It was a highly technical and strategic competition. Their dominance in the octagon helped elevate the sport's credibility, attracting more talent from traditional martial arts backgrounds and further diversifying the skill sets on display. With their success, the UFC continued its rise, attracting record-breaking crowds and setting the stage for the next phase of its evolution: international expansion. The UFC goes global. With its dominance in the United States established, the UFC set its sights on international expansion. Recognizing the global appeal of combat sports, the organization began hosting events in new markets, starting with the United Kingdom, Canada, and Brazil. These countries had deep-rooted martial arts traditions and a strong appetite for high-level competition. By bringing UFC events to these regions, the promotion tapped into a passionate fan base eager to witness the world's best fighters compete live. The UFC's expansion strategy was not just about hosting events, it also involved scouting international talent and signing fighters from different backgrounds to create a truly global roster. The company's push into new regions also led to the rise of international superstars. Georges St-Pierre, a national hero in Canada, became one of the sport's biggest pay-per-view draws. In Brazil, Anderson Silva and Jose Aldo dominated their divisions, reigniting the country's love for fighting and inspiring the next generation of MMA fighters. Meanwhile, European fighters like Michael Bisping and Khabib Nurmagomedov proved that the UFC was no longer just an American phenomenon. As the organization expanded into Asia and the Middle East, it opened performance institutes to develop fighters from emerging markets, ensuring the future of the sport remained strong. With fighters from all over the world now competing, the UFC cemented itself as the premier global combat sports organization, proving that MMA was a worldwide movement. The acquisition of rival promotions. As the UFC grew into a global powerhouse, it began absorbing rival organizations to solidify its dominance over the MMA landscape. In 2007, the UFC acquired Pride Fighting Championships, Japan's biggest MMA promotion, bringing legendary fighters like Wanderlei Silva, Mirko Cro Cop, and Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira into the UFC roster. This marked a major shift in the sport, as many of the world's top fighters were now competing under one banner. The deal was not just about acquiring fighters, it was also about absorbing Pride's legacy, which had been a dominant force in MMA throughout the early 2000s. While the UFC was thriving in the US, Pride had built a massive following in Japan, hosting some of the most legendary fights in MMA history. The acquisitions didn't stop there. In 2011, the UFC purchased Strikeforce, home to future superstars like Daniel Cormier, Ronda Rousey, and Nick Diaz. That same year, it also merged with World Extreme Cage Fighting, WEC, integrating elite lighter-weight fighters, including Jose Aldo and Dominic Cruz. By consolidating these organizations, the UFC eliminated competition while strengthening its roster with some of the best talent in the world. The move not only increased the organization's star power, but also introduced new fighting styles and strategies, further diversifying the sport. This period of consolidation cemented the UFC's position as the undisputed leader in mixed martial arts, ensuring that all major talent was now under one roof. The rise of Ronda Rousey and women's MMA. For years, Dana White insisted that women would never fight in the UFC. That changed in 2013 when Ronda Rousey made history as the first female fighter signed to the promotion. A former Olympic judoka, Rousey brought an aggressive fighting style and a star presence that transcended MMA. She dominated the women's bantamweight division with lightning-fast armbar submissions, finishing opponents in record time and becoming the UFC's biggest mainstream attraction. Her crossover appeal extended beyond the octagon, landing her roles in Hollywood films and mainstream sponsorships. Rousey's rise was meteoric, proving that women's MMA could be just as exciting and commercially viable as the men's divisions. Rousey's success paved the way for an entire generation of female fighters, leading to the creation of multiple women's divisions. Fighters like Amanda Nunes, Holly Holm, and Joanna Jędrzejczyk emerged as champions, proving that women's MMA was as competitive and thrilling as any men's division. Holm's shocking knockout victory over Rousey in 2015 marked a pivotal moment, showing that the women's divisions had true depth and unpredictability. Meanwhile, Amanda Nunes established herself as one of the greatest fighters of all time, by dominating multiple divisions and defeating legends. Thanks to Rousey's impact, female fighters became an integral part of the UFC, breaking barriers and drawing millions of fans worldwide. Women's MMA was no longer an experiment. It was a vital part of the sport's future. The McGregor era and the global explosion of MMA. While the UFC had already grown into a major sports entity, no fighter propelled it to greater heights than Conor McGregor. The charismatic Irishman burst onto the scene in 2013, captivating audiences with his bold predictions, sharp trash talk, and devastating knockout power. His meteoric rise saw him claim the featherweight title in 2015 by knocking out Jose Aldo in just 13 seconds, the fastest finish in UFC title fight history. McGregor's brash persona, combined with his ability to back up his words with spectacular performances, made him a global icon. He became must-watch television, drawing massive crowds to press conferences and record-breaking pay-per-view numbers. McGregor's star power was unmatched. In 2016, he made history again by becoming the first fighter to hold 2 UFC championships simultaneously, winning the lightweight belt by dismantling Eddie Alvarez. His fights shattered pay-per-view records, and his influence extended beyond MMA when he crossed over into boxing for a super fight against Floyd Mayweather in 2017. That bout, one of the most lucrative in combat sports history, cemented McGregor as one of the biggest names in sports. His impact on the UFC was transformative, attracting millions of new fans to MMA and elevating the sport's global profile. The McGregor era proved that an MMA fighter could achieve worldwide superstardom, setting a new benchmark for future UFC athletes. The UFC's partnership with ESPN and the streaming era. As the UFC continued to grow, it secured one of the most significant deals in its history, a multi-billion-dollar partnership with ESPN in 2019. This agreement brought UFC events to the world's leading sports network, increasing its exposure and cementing its status as a mainstream sport. For the first time, UFC pay-per-views were sold exclusively through ESPN+, signaling a shift toward the streaming era and digital media dominance. The move was a game-changer, allowing fans to access UFC content more easily while boosting the organization's financial strength. With ESPN's backing, the UFC gained unparalleled promotional opportunities, putting its fighters in front of a larger audience than ever before. With ESPN support, the UFC expanded its event schedule, hosting more fights than ever before. The promotion also saw a surge in sponsorships, high-profile partnerships, and record-breaking revenues. This period marked a new chapter for the UFC, where business strategy became just as important as the fights inside the octagon. The ESPN deal not only secured the UFC's financial future, but also positioned it as one of the most valuable sports franchises in the world. This transition to digital broadcasting reflected the changing landscape of sports entertainment, where streaming services were rapidly overtaking traditional cable television as the preferred method of consumption. The Khabib era and the legacy of dominance. Amidst the UFC's mainstream explosion, one fighter emerged as the most dominant force in MMA, Khabib Nurmagomedov. The undefeated Russian lightweight built a reputation for his relentless grappling, crushing pressure, and unmatched endurance. After years of climbing the ranks, he captured the UFC Lightweight Championship in 2018, beginning one of the most dominant reigns in the sport's history. Unlike many other champions, Khabib's approach to fighting was rooted in suffocating control, neutralizing even the most dangerous strikers with ease. His ability to impose his will on world-class opponents made him one of the most feared fighters in UFC history. Khabib's most famous moment came in 2018 when he defeated Conor McGregor in the biggest pay-per-view event in UFC history at UFC 229. The fight's heated build-up, intense rivalry, and post-fight chaos cemented it as one of the most memorable moments in combat sports. In 2020, Khabib retired with a perfect 29-0 record, leaving behind a legacy of dominance and respect. His impact not only elevated MMA in Russia and the Middle East, but also reinforced the importance of elite grappling in the modern UFC landscape. Khabib's departure left a void in the lightweight division, sparking debates about who would take up the mantle of dominance he had established during his reign. The pandemic era and UFC's unstoppable growth. In 2020, the world came to a standstill due to the COVID-19 pandemic, forcing major sports leagues to shut down. However, the UFC, under Dana White's leadership, became one of the first organizations to resume operations. By creating a biosecure environment on Fight Island in Abu Dhabi, the UFC continued hosting events while other sports remained on pause, solidifying its reputation as a resilient and adaptable promotion. The Fight Island concept captured the imagination of fans worldwide, providing a unique setting where fighters competed under strict safety protocols. This move not only kept the UFC active, but also reinforced its ability to innovate under challenging circumstances. The rise of a new generation of champions. As the UFC emerged from the pandemic era, a new wave of fighters took center stage, redefining the sport with their unique styles and dominant performances. Israel Adesanya, a former kickboxer, dazzled fans with his precision, striking, and charismatic personality, ruling the middleweight division. Kamaru Usman, a relentless wrestler, established himself as one of the most dominant welterweight champions, securing multiple title defenses with his evolving skill set. Meanwhile, Francis Ngannou captivated the world with his incredible knockout power, capturing the heavyweight title in 2021 and solidifying his place as the most feared striker in UFC history. Each of these fighters brought their own flair, ensuring that the sport remained dynamic and unpredictable. Women's MMA also witnessed a shift as Valentina Shevchenko and Amanda Nunes continued their reigns while new contenders emerged. Fighters such as Rose Namajunas and Zhang Weili showcased high-level skill and resilience, proving that the women's divisions were just as competitive as the men's. With fresh talent consistently rising through the ranks, the UFC maintained its reputation for delivering elite-level fights. This new generation of champions carried the UFC into an era of unparalleled competition, setting the stage for even greater battles to come. As MMA continued evolving, it became clear that no fighter could dominate indefinitely, making the sport even more exciting for fans worldwide. The merger with WWE and the birth of TKO Group. In 2023, the UFC took another massive step in its evolution by merging with World Wrestling Entertainment, WWE, under their parent company, Endeavor. This historic deal led to the formation of TKO Group Holdings, a publicly traded sports and entertainment powerhouse valued at over $21 billion. The merger combined the UFC's elite combat sports brand with WWE's global entertainment reach, creating unprecedented opportunities for cross-promotion and business expansion. By uniting two of the biggest combat-based entertainment companies, TKO aimed to dominate both real and scripted fighting markets. While the UFC remained focused on real competition, the partnership with WWE opened new doors for marketing, sponsorships, and audience engagement. With both companies sharing resources and platforms, fighters gained greater exposure, and the UFC continued its transformation into a multi-billion-dollar entertainment juggernaut. This strategic move positioned the organization for even greater commercial success, securing its future as the dominant force in global combat sports. The UFC's evolution into a mainstream entertainment entity was undeniable, further bridging the gap between combat sports and mass media entertainment. The future of the UFC and emerging superstars. As the UFC moves into the next decade, a new generation of superstars is emerging, ready to carry the sport to even greater heights. Fighters like Sean O'Malley, Islam Makhachev, and Alex Pereira are redefining their divisions with elite skills and star power, attracting fresh waves of fans worldwide. The organization continues scouting global talent, with future champions rising from regions like Africa, Asia, and South America, ensuring MMA remains the fastest-growing combat sport. With the UFC Performance Institutes expanding worldwide, young fighters now have access to elite training and conditioning, making the competition tougher than ever. The next wave of talent is more well-rounded than previous generations, blending striking, grappling, and athleticism at unprecedented levels. Beyond individual stars, the UFC is investing in new technologies, including advanced sports analytics, virtual reality fan experiences, and AI-driven training systems. With fighter pay debates, weight-cutting controversies, and performance-enhancing drug policies still in discussion, the sport will continue evolving to meet modern demands. The UFC is also expanding its reach into new broadcasting territories, forming lucrative media deals that enhance its global viewership. As MMA grows, one thing remains certain. The UFC is not just a promotion, it is the undisputed leader in combat sports, shaping the future of fighting for generations to come. The organization is actively searching for ways to balance sports integrity with entertainment value, ensuring long-term success in an increasingly digital world. The UFC's legacy and lasting impact. From its no-holds-barred beginnings to becoming a global sports empire, the UFC has revolutionized combat sports like no other organization. What started as a controversial spectacle in 1993 is now a multi-billion-dollar industry featuring elite athletes competing at the highest level. The rise of superstars, groundbreaking rule changes, and the UFC's ability to adapt and expand have cemented its place as the most dominant force in MMA. The promotion has weathered political opposition, financial struggles, and public scrutiny, emerging stronger each time. Today, UFC events sell out arenas worldwide, breaking records for viewership and revenue, solidifying its position as a global sports juggernaut. Looking ahead, the UFC's influence will only continue to grow, shaping the future of combat sports worldwide. With new markets, fighters, and innovations, the organization is poised to remain at the forefront of athletic excellence and entertainment. The Octagon has become more than just a cage. It's a proving ground where legends are made and history is written. As long as there are warriors willing to fight, the UFC will continue to thrive, inspiring millions across the globe. Whether through the development of new stars, technological advancements, or business expansions, the UFC's future remains as thrilling as its past, with endless possibilities for growth and evolution.